Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. The land west of Albuquerque, New Mexico is a stark tapestry of sandstone mesas, ancient lava flows, and sun-bleached plains. It is a place where history is not measured in centuries, but in millennia. The Pueblo of Laguna and the Pueblo of Acoma are two of the oldest continuously inhabited communities in North America, their people having carved a life from this demanding environment for countless generations. Their cultural and spiritual identity is inextricably linked to the land itself. Specific mesas, springs, and rock formations are not just features of a landscape, but living sacred parts of their cosmology, repositories of power and memory that predate the concept of ownership as we understand it. To an outsider, much of this land falls under the purview of the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, designated for public use, grazing, mining, recreation. The boundaries are often marked by little more than a weathered fence post or a faded sign. For weekend adventurers from the city, these are abstract lines on a map, bureaucratic distinctions between one patch of dirt and another. For the people who have always been there, the indigenous communities whose ancestors watched the stars from these same ridges, they are something else entirely. They are the border between the mundane world and a place of immense power, a place where the oldest laws still hold sway, where the land itself watches and remembers. I am a mechanical engineer by training and by temperament. I solve problems. I trust data, coordinates, verified measurements. I had the spot picked out for weeks, maybe even a full month of research and planning. A perfect sandstone rise, coordinates cross-referenced between 3 different topographical maps, and satellite imagery downloaded from USGS servers. It offered a clean, unobstructed view of the western sky, far from the light pollution of Albuquerque, yet less than a 90-minute drive from my apartment in the Northeast Heights. It was, by every metric I valued, elevation, accessibility, light pollution index, distance from urban centers, the ideal location for stargazing. I had even checked historical weather data. September in the high desert promised clear skies 87% of the time. The 4 of us set out on a Friday afternoon in late September 2017. Me, my girlfriend Chloe, our friend Ben, and his colleague Maya. We cruised west on Interstate 40 in my truck, the familiar silhouette of the Sandia Mountains shrinking in the rearview mirror. Ben was telling some loud, rambling story about a competition at his CrossFit gym, something about deadlifts and a guy who passed out. Chloe was laughing, her hand resting on my knee as I drove. Maya, a graduate student in anthropology at the University of New Mexico, was quiet in the back seat, watching the landscape slide by with an intensity that struck me even then. She had a way of looking at things, at the mesas and the arroyos, as if she were reading a text I couldn't see, interpreting symbols in the contours of the earth itself. "Exit's coming up," I announced, breaking into Ben's story. "Not the main one for Laguna, the one after. A few miles past the casino and the old mission church, visible from the highway with its white stucco walls and twin bell towers." I took an exit that led to nothing but a frontage road running parallel to the interstate. The asphalt gave way to gravel after a quarter mile. A minute later, I turned the truck onto a dirt track that was barely more than 2 tire ruts in the pale earth. The kind of road that doesn't appear on GPS systems. The suspension groaned as we bounced over rocks and washouts. 20 minutes of this bone-jarring progress, the dust plume behind us visible in the side mirrors, and we came upon it. A single rust-brown metal T-post driven into the ground at an angle, as if the earth had tried to reject it. Bolted to it with rusted bolts was a faded sign, its surface pocked with what looked unmistakably like holes from a shotgun blast. The words were barely legible beneath layers of grime and sun damage. "Private Pueblo land. No trespassing." Beneath that, in smaller letters, "Violators will be prosecuted." I stopped the truck, the engine idling, dust settling around us in the still air. "This is it?" Ben asked from the back seat, leaning forward between the front seats to see. "This is the old boundary?" "Exactly," I said, tapping a finger on the laminated BLM map I had on the passenger seat, one of 3 maps I'd brought. The land swap agreement was in 2007, 10 years ago. This sign is obsolete. According to the federal government, the official reservation line is another 2 miles east of here. We're on public land, perfectly legal. I verified it with the BLM field office in Albuquerque. Maya leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the sign with an expression I couldn't quite read. Are you sure about that, Liam? Sometimes those boundary agreements are complicated. The federal maps don't always reflect what the Pueblo considers theirs. Sovereignty issues are... It's not complicated, I interrupted, hearing the edge in my own voice. It's a line on a map, a legal survey conducted by the federal government. We're on public land. We have every right to be here. Ben clapped his hands together with false enthusiasm. Good enough for the government. Good enough for me. Let's find this 5-star resort of yours, Liam. I put the truck in gear and drove past the post without further discussion. In the side mirror, I saw Maya look back at the sign until we rounded a bend and a low ridge blocked it from view. I told myself her concerns were academic, theoretical. This was federal land. The map said so. The law said so. What else mattered? The spot was even better than the map had suggested. A wide, flat-topped sandstone formation that rose about 100 feet from the surrounding scrubland, accessible via a natural ramp of broken rock on its southern face. The surface was roughly the size of a tennis court, weathered smooth by millennia of wind. It gave us a commanding 360-degree view. To the east, the sky was already starting to show the faint dome of city glow from Albuquerque, a diffuse orange stain on the horizon. To the west, nothing but the vast dark expanse of the El Malpais lava field stretching toward Arizona, an ancient flow of basalt that looked like frozen black water. Directly across a wide, shallow canyon from our position, perhaps half a mile distant, was another mesa, slightly higher than ours. Its edge formed a sharp, dark line against the sky, its profile jagged with juniper and pinyon trees. Between us and that opposite ridge was emptiness, a canyon floor of pale dirt, scattered sage, and stones. We were completely, utterly alone. No other tire tracks, no trash, no sign that anyone had been here in months, maybe years. I felt a surge of satisfaction as we unloaded the gear. This was what preparation looked like. This was what freedom meant. The ability to research, to plan, to execute, to claim a piece of public land and use it as intended. No crowds, no light pollution, no noise. Just us and the stars. We set up camp quickly, working with the efficiency of people who'd done this before. The tents went up, 2 of them, a larger one for Chloe and me, a smaller one for Ben and Maya. The fire pit was established in a natural depression in the rock that would shelter the flames from wind. Within an hour we had a proper campsite, and soon the smell of grilling sausages cut through the clean, dry air. The sun hung low on the western horizon, turning the sky into a canvas of violent oranges and purples, the kind of sunset you only get in the desert where there's no humidity to soften the light. The initial mood was celebratory. Ben cracked open beers from the cooler. Chloe put on some music from a small Bluetooth speaker, something indie and mellow. We watched the high desert sunset paint the clouds, the temperature dropping noticeably as the sun descended. The transition from day to night happens fast in the desert, faster than people from humid climates expect. One moment there's light, the next, the world is shades of purple and gray. You know, Chloe said, leaning against me as we sat on camp chairs near the fire. Sometimes I forget how quiet it can get out here. There's nothing, not even crickets. She was right. The silence was profound, a solid thing that pressed in from all sides once Chloe turned off the music. In the city, silence is relative. There's always the hum of air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic, the ambient noise of human civilization. Here, there was nothing. The absence of sound was so complete it was almost audible, a ringing in the ears that might have been the sound of our own nervous systems. As the last sliver of sun vanished below the horizon, and the sky transformed into a deep indigo scattered with emerging stars, I started setting up my telescope, a decent 8-inch Dobsonian I'd saved for months to buy. The thin air at this altitude made the stars look like holes punched in black velvet. I was pointing out the summer triangle to Chloe Vega, Deneb, Altair, when Maya, who had been sitting on the edge of the rise looking out over the canyon, her silhouette dark against the darkening sky, suddenly stiffened. Liam. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the night with an urgency that made us all turn. Who is that? We all turned to look where she was pointing. Across the canyon toward the opposite ridge. On the crest of that mesa, silhouetted perfectly against the deep indigo of the twilight sky, were 4 figures. They were distinctly human in shape. Heads, torsos, arms, legs, but that was the only discernible feature. They were impossibly still, standing evenly spaced from one another in a straight line, all facing directly toward our campsite. The distance was significant, perhaps half a mile, but even from this range their absolute stillness was obvious, unnatural. People don't stand like that, motionless as statues for no apparent reason. My mind immediately started cycling through explanations, that automatic problem-solving reflex that engineers develop. Other campers who'd gotten a late start. Locals out for an evening hike who'd spotted our fire. Maybe they were curious about who was camping out here. Maybe they were trying to decide if we were on their land or public land, conducting their own survey of sorts. Probably just people from the Pueblo, Ben said. Though his voice had lost its boisterous edge, the confidence had drained from it. He grabbed the high-powered binoculars from my truck's glove box, expensive Zeiss optics I'd bought for wildlife watching, and raised them to his eyes. He adjusted the focus wheel, then was silent for a long moment that stretched uncomfortably. "What do you see?" I asked, hearing the tension in my own voice. "I can't make out any features," he said slowly, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "No clothes, no faces. They just look dark, like shadows standing up. But they're definitely people. The shape is human. They're just too far away, maybe, or the light's wrong." An involuntary sensation moved down my back. That primitive animal response to being watched by something you can't identify. The distance was significant, but even from here their stillness was deeply wrong. People shift their weight. They move their heads. They gesture to each other. These figures did nothing. They simply stood, four evenly spaced shapes on a distant ridge, watching us in the gathering darkness. "Hello," Ben shouted suddenly, lowering the binoculars. His voice carried across the canyon, bouncing off the rocks, the sound quickly swallowed by the immense space. "We're just camping. Can you hear us?" There was no reply. No wave. No movement at all. The four shapes remained motionless, as if they hadn't heard, or as if our presence in Ben's shouting meant nothing to them. The silence that followed his shout seemed deeper than before, as if the land itself were holding something back. We stood there, the four of us clustered near the fire, watching them watch us. The sausages on the grill started to burn, the smell acrid and unpleasant. Chloe turned off her music without being asked. The silence rushed back in, heavier than before, oppressive in a way that silence shouldn't be. My rational mind kept offering explanations. They were too far away to hear us. They were just watching the sunset from the other side. They'd leave soon, but none of the explanations felt adequate. The feeling of being observed was too intense, too specific. "Maybe they're park rangers," Chloe offered, her voice small and uncertain, "or BLM officers checking on campers." "In the dark, without vehicles, without lights?" Maya's voice was flat. She hadn't taken her eyes off the figures. "That's not rangers." For the next 2 hours, as we tried to eat our burned sausages and sat around the fire passing a bottle of whiskey that Ben had brought, the figures remained. We ate in near silence, our eyes constantly drawn back to them despite our attempts at normal conversation. As full night descended, and the moon began to rise, a waning gibbous bright enough to cast shadows, they became harder to distinguish from the gnarled juniper trees that dotted the ridgeline, but we knew they were still there. Every time I looked, I could make them out, four vertical shapes against the slightly lighter sky, evenly spaced, still facing our direction. The feeling was inescapable. We were being observed, studied, judged. The back of my neck prickled constantly. I found myself fighting the urge to look over my shoulder at our own campsite, irrationally convinced that something was behind me, though our position on top of the mesa meant nothing could approach without being visible. Finally, around 11 o'clock, the cold and a creeping sense of dread that had settled into all of us like a sickness drove us from the fire. "I'm turning in," Chloe said, her voice barely above a whisper. She looked at me with an expression that I recognized as barely controlled fear. "I can't sit here anymore with them watching." One by one, we retreated to our tents, zipping the thin nylon walls shut against the vast silent dark and the feeling of eyes upon us. I lay there in my sleeping bag next to Chloe, my heart beating a little too fast, staring at the fabric ceiling that glowed faintly with reflected moonlight. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself that in the morning they would be gone, and we would laugh about how jumpy we'd been, how we'd let our imaginations run wild in an unfamiliar place. People do that in the wilderness. They see patterns in randomness, threat in the unknown. But as I listened to the profound, unnerving silence of the land, interrupted only by Chloe's irregular breathing beside me, and the occasional creak of the tent fabric in a breeze I couldn't feel, I couldn't shake the image of those four motionless figures. They were still out there. I knew it, and they were still watching. I woke with a jolt, my heart hammering, from a dream I couldn't remember. The pale gray light of dawn was filtering through the thin nylon of the tent, turning everything inside a dim blue-green. My first conscious thought was of them. I unzipped the tent flap with a single sharp pull and looked out across the canyon before I was even fully awake. The opposite ridge was empty. Just rock and juniper and pinyon pine, stark against the brightening sky. The air was cold and still, that perfect desert morning clarity where you can see for miles. No movement, no figures, nothing but the landscape itself. The relief that washed over me was immediate and overwhelming, followed almost instantly by embarrassment. What had we been afraid of? People on a ridge, that's all it had been. Some locals, maybe teenagers, who'd seen our fire and decided to mess with the city people. They'd succeeded. We'd spent the night jumping at shadows. "They're gone," I said to Chloe, who was just stirring beside me in her sleeping bag, her hair a tangled mess. "The ridge is empty." Soon we were all out of our tents. Coffee brewing on the camp stove, the morning ritual providing a flimsy shield against the memory of the night before. The smell of coffee, that universally comforting scent, did more to restore normalcy than anything else could have. "See?" Ben said, stretching his arms over his head, his voice deliberately loud and cheerful. "Probably just some kids messing with us. Got bored and went home. We totally let them get to us. We're idiots." "Exactly," I agreed, seizing on the logic of it with perhaps too much enthusiasm. "We'll probably see their tire tracks on the way out. 4 kids on dirt bikes or something, having a laugh at the gringos." Only Maya was quiet. She stood at the edge of the rise, sipping her coffee from a metal camping mug, and staring at the empty ridge as if she could still see the figures there, as if they'd left impressions on the air itself. When she finally turned back to us, her expression was troubled. "Did anyone else notice," she said carefully, "that we never saw them arrive or leave? They were just there, and then not there." "It got dark," Ben said dismissively. "We couldn't see everything. They probably left while we were in the tents." In complete silence, across terrain like that, Maya gestured at the canyon floor, the loose rock and scrub that would be impossible to navigate quietly, especially at night. "No flashlights? No sound?" "Maya," I said, hearing the impatience in my voice, "it's daytime. They're gone. Let's just enjoy the morning and not—" "I'm just saying it was strange," she said quietly, then turned back to her coffee. We tried to salvage the day with our planned hike, a loop around the base of our mesa that would give us different perspectives of the landscape. But the mood was broken. The vast, silent landscape no longer felt like a majestic wilderness, an escape from urban life. It felt like an empty room where you knew someone was hiding, where the silence itself was a kind of presence. Every dark recess in the rocks, every oddly shaped tree drew our eyes. We kept glancing over our shoulders. The silence, which had seemed peaceful the previous afternoon, now felt expectant, as if the land were waiting for something. We cut the hike short after less than an hour, and returned to the relative safety of the campsite on top of the mesa. The unspoken agreement was that we'd pack up after lunch and head back to Albuquerque a day early. No one said it directly, but we all felt it. We wanted to leave. This place no longer felt welcoming. It felt like we'd overstayed, like we were guests who'd missed the polite signals to go. As the sun began its descent that afternoon, the anxiety returned. Thick, suffocating, undeniable. No one suggested music this time. We built the fire higher than necessary, its crackle and pop, the only sounds pushing back against the immense quiet of the desert evening. We all kept scanning the opposite ridge, a shared compulsive habit we couldn't break. It remained empty. The juniper trees swayed slightly in a breeze we couldn't feel on our sheltered mesa top. Nothing else moved. For a few hours, as the light faded and the first stars appeared in the darkening eastern sky, I allowed myself to hope it was over. We'd have a quiet evening, sleep with the tent flaps open to the cool air, and drive home in the morning with a weird story to tell. Strange encounter with locals spooked us, but nothing happened. We'd laugh about it eventually. Chloe had gone to the truck to get another jacket from behind the driver's seat. She was halfway back to the fire, about 20 feet away, when she stopped dead. A small, sharp gasp escaped her lips. She pointed, her hand trembling visibly even in the firelight. "Liam." It was barely a whisper, all the air gone from her voice. My head snapped in the direction of her gaze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. At the base of our own sandstone rise, just at the edge where the firelight faded into darkness, was one of the figures. It stood in the same unnaturally rigid posture we'd seen across the canyon, a solid black shape against the scrub brush, no more than 100 yards away. It was human in outline, a head, shoulders, torso, but it absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It was a hole in the visible world shaped like a person. It hadn't been there 30 seconds before. I'd been looking in that direction while Chloe walked to the truck. There had been nothing. No shape, no movement, no sound of approach across the loose rock and gravel that surrounded our position. It was simply there now, as if it had materialized from the darkness itself. Panic, raw and electric, shot through our group. I started to yell something, a warning, a challenge. My voice wouldn't form words, it just came out as a strangled sound. My engineering mind was screaming at me that this was impossible, that objects don't appear, that there had to be an explanation, but my body was responding to something older than logic, pure animal terror. Ben reacted with rage, fear twisting instantly into aggression. "I'm done with this," he snarled, his face contorted. He grabbed the heavy 4-cell mag light from the truck bed, the kind that's essentially a club with a light on it. "I'm done with this game." "Ben, no," Maya cried out, stepping toward him. "Don't." "Ben, stop," I yelled, finding my voice. "Don't go near it." He ignored us both. He strode toward the figure with deliberate, aggressive steps, the flashlight beam cutting a stark white path through the darkness. The beam swung wildly as he walked, illuminating scrub brush and rock. He walked with a purpose that was terrifying to watch. All his fear channeled into forward motion, into confrontation. The figure remained motionless, that same absolute stillness. As Ben closed the distance, 50 feet, 40, 30, something strange happened. When he was about 20 feet away, close enough that we should have been able to see detail, to see what it was made of, the figure seemed to thin. It didn't run or fade in the way a normal object would disappear. It was more like the darkness it was made of became indistinguishable from the deeper shadows of the juniper bushes behind it. The solid shape dispersed, broke apart into shadow and negative space, and then it was gone. Ben swept the powerful beam back and forth across the empty space where it had stood. The circle of white light revealing only sage and rock and twisted wood. "Nothing," he called back to us, his voice shaky but loud, almost angry. "It's gone. There's nothing here. Nothing." He walked back to the fire, his face pale in the flickering light, the mag light hanging from his hand. He was trying to project bravado, trying to convince himself and us that he'd won some kind of confrontation, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the flashlight. "I'm going to my tent for a minute," he said abruptly. "I need a minute." He disappeared inside his tent, zipping it shut behind him. We heard him moving around inside, heard the rustle of fabric and equipment. Then, after maybe 30 seconds of silence, we heard a choked guttural cry of pure horror. We all rushed to his tent and threw back the flap, our hands clumsy with fear. Ben was sitting on his sleeping bag, his shirt pulled off, twisted in his hands. He was staring at his own reflection in a small hand mirror, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Across his back, from shoulder blade to lower ribs, were 3 deep parallel gouges. They were raw and red against his skin, the edges inflamed. They were perfectly straight, as if drawn with a ruler, each line exactly parallel to the others, spaced about an inch apart. Yet they had depth and texture. They looked like claw marks, like something with 3 curved talons had raked down his back with precision. They were beginning to bleed, dark fluid welling up along the lines and running down toward his waist. "Nothing touched me," he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably as he looked up at us. His eyes were wide, the whites visible all around the iris, prey animal eyes. I was just standing there. I turned around. Nothing touched me. Nothing was there. But this. He gestured helplessly at his back, at the impossible wounds that had appeared without cause. That broke me. My carefully constructed wall of logic, of rational explanations, of materialist certainty, crumbled into dust. This was not a prank. This was not a misunderstanding or a trick of the light or shared hysteria. This was real. Whatever was happening here operated by rules I didn't understand, in a reality that didn't match the physics I'd spent years studying. "Pack everything," I ordered, my voice tight and unfamiliar, the voice of someone trying to maintain control while their world collapsed. "Pack it now. We're leaving. We're leaving right now." Absolute animal terror gave us a frantic energy. We threw our gear into the bed of the truck with clumsy, desperate haste. Tents were collapsed without being folded, stakes left in the ground. Sleeping bags were tossed in still in their stuff sacks. The cooler of food was abandoned entirely next to the dead fire, too heavy to bother with. The telescope, my expensive telescope, was thrown in the truck bed without its case. The optics exposed. All that mattered was getting into the steel cage of the truck and driving away from this place. I jumped into the driver's seat, Chloe beside me, with Maya and a pale, shivering Ben in the back seat. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 2 tries to get the key into the ignition. I turned it. The engine turned over. I could hear it cranking. That healthy, strong sound of a starter motor engaging. It did not catch. The engine didn't fire. I tried again, my foot pumping the gas pedal. Nothing. The engine cranked and cranked, the battery strong, the starter working perfectly, but the engine itself refused to start. It was a simple, mechanical, and complete refusal. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, my knuckles white. I tried again and again, my initial panic giving way to a rising tide of helpless fury. The headlights blazed. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. The radio would have played if I'd turned it on. Every electronic component was functioning perfectly, but the engine, the simple internal combustion engine that I understood on a mechanical level, that I could disassemble and rebuild, would not fire. A small, horrified sound came from Maya in the back seat. "Liam, stop!" Her voice was so strange, so flat and certain, that I actually did stop cranking the engine. I turned to look at her. She was staring out the back window at the ground illuminated by the truck's reverse lights, her face pressed against the glass. She slowly opened her door and got out. I followed, my legs barely supporting my weight, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. By the stark white light of the headlamps and the red glow of the taillights, Maya pointed to the ground with a steady hand. Scratched into the hard-packed dirt, etched deep enough to be visible in the angled light, was a circle. It was nearly perfect, maybe 30 feet in diameter. It enclosed the truck, the dead fire pit, and the flattened spaces where our tents had been. Within its boundary, carved into the earth with a precision that shouldn't have been possible without surveying equipment, were symbols. They were intricate, disturbing in their complexity. Some were sharp geometric patterns, triangles within triangles, spirals that hurt to follow with your eyes, angular shapes that seemed to have too many sides. Others looked like stylized forms of animals, something with a curved spine and too many legs, a bird with wings spread at angles that violated symmetry, a figure that might have been human or might have been something else, its limbs bent in directions that bones don't bend. The symbols covered the interior of the circle, overlapping and interconnecting, a language or a map or a warning that we couldn't read. They hadn't been there that morning. I had walked over this ground. I had looked at it in daylight. They surrounded us completely now, a boundary drawn in the earth itself. We were trapped. There was no discussion about trying to cross the circle. The symbols etched into the dirt were a barrier more absolute than a concrete wall, more real than any fence or gate. We understood that in a way that bypassed rational thought. To cross that line would be to invite something worse than we'd already experienced. The rules of this place, whatever they were, had been made clear. We rebuilt the fire, piling on wood until the flames leaped 6 feet high, pushing back the darkness in a circle of desperate light. But the fire offered no real comfort. It just made the darkness beyond seem deeper, more solid, and more filled with intent. We huddled together, 4 people on a tiny island in an ocean of hostile silence. I don't think any of us slept. We sat in camp chairs pulled close to the fire, our backs to each other so we could watch all directions at once. Every half hour, like a grim ritual driven by desperate hope, I would get up, walk to the truck, and turn the key. The result was always the same: the healthy, strong crank of a perfectly functional starter motor, and an engine that simply refused to catch. It was mechanically impossible, and yet it happened again and again. After each failure, I would return to the fire, the metallic taste of dread thick in my mouth, and report the same thing: nothing, it won't start. We didn't see the figures again. Not directly, But the feeling of being scrutinized, of being watched by something that did not have eyes as we understand them, was a physical weight. The air itself felt heavy, dense with a pressure that made it hard to draw a full breath. My ears popped repeatedly, as if the atmospheric pressure were changing, though my altimeter watch showed we were at the same elevation. The silence was wrong. In a natural place, there's always sound. Wind, insects, small animals moving. Here there was nothing. Even the fire seemed to burn quietly, as if the sound of crackling wood were being absorbed by something unseen. We just sat there, feeding wood into the flames, waiting for the sun. Around 3 in the morning, Maya spoke for the first time in hours. "We crossed a boundary," she said quietly, staring into the fire. "Not the one marked by that sign. Something older." "What do you mean?" Chloe asked, her voice hoarse from not speaking. "The Pueblo people. They have concepts that don't translate well. Restricted areas, places where certain ceremonies happen, or where things live that shouldn't be disturbed. They're not marked on maps. They're passed down generation to generation. Oral tradition. This might be one of those places." "How were we supposed to know that?" Ben said, his voice cracking. He'd wrapped himself in a blanket, shivering despite the fire's heat. The scratches on his back had stopped bleeding, but the wounds were still there, visible and impossible. "That's the point," Maya said, her voice infinitely sad. "We weren't supposed to be here at all. The boundaries aren't for outsiders. They're not on federal maps because the Pueblo doesn't recognize federal authority over certain lands. There are layers of ownership, layers of permission, that the BLM doesn't acknowledge. We walked into something." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the thought. The hours until dawn were the longest of my life. Every sound, a shift in the fire, the creak of a camp chair made us flinch. We were all suffering from exhaustion, from adrenaline crash, from the sustained terror of being trapped in a place where the fundamental rules of reality seemed negotiable. The moment the eastern sky began to bleed from black to gray, a decision was made without a single word being spoken. We were walking out. I looked at my truck, my meticulously maintained Ford F-150, my pride, my proof of self-sufficiency. I looked at the tents, the Yeti cooler that had cost $200, the camping chairs, the telescope that represented months of savings, thousands of dollars of gear that 12 hours ago had been symbols of preparedness and independence. Now it was just weight, just objects tying us to this place. "We leave it all," I said. No one argued. I grabbed a backpack, stuffing it with the 4 remaining bottles of water and a handful of protein bars from the truck. The others did the same. We were abandoning everything else. The truck, the gear, all of it. We would walk. I consulted my paper map with shaking hands, my exhaustion making it hard to focus on the contour lines. The interstate was too far north, at least 15 miles across rough terrain. Our only realistic chance was New Mexico State Road 124, about 7 miles south. 7 miles across high desert with no trails, no water sources, and no guarantee that anyone would come along that road even if we reached it. "We can do 7 miles, I said with more confidence than I felt. "We just need to reach that highway. Someone will drive by, someone will stop." Stepping out of the circle of symbols felt like breaking the surface of water after being held under for too long. The pressure released. The air suddenly seemed lighter, easier to breathe. We scrambled down the side of the sandstone rise, loose rock sliding under our boots, and began the trek across the canyon floor toward the south. The terrain was brutal. A chaotic mix of loose rock, thorny scrub that tore at our pants and hands, and steep-sided arroyos that forced us into long detours. Each arroyo was a small canyon carved by ancient water flow, 15 or 20 feet deep with crumbling walls. We had to find places to climb down one side and up the other, wasting time and energy, the detours adding miles to an already desperate journey. The New Mexico sun climbed the sky, and the heat became a physical force. By 10 in the morning, the temperature was approaching 90 degrees. We'd left in such panic that none of us had proper hiking clothes. I was in jeans and a t-shirt. Chloe wore running shoes completely inadequate for this terrain. Ben, already weakened by shock and blood loss from the wounds on his back, stumbled constantly. By noon, we'd covered maybe 3 miles. Ben could barely walk. The scratches on his back were an angry red, the edges looking inflamed and infected. His face was a mask of vacant terror, his eyes unfocused. He'd stopped speaking entirely. Chloe and I had to support him between us for much of the way, each of us with one of his arms over our shoulders, half carrying him across the broken ground. Maya walked ahead, her face grim and determined, checking her phone compass every few minutes to keep us oriented south. None of our phones had signal. We were too far from any cell tower, but the compass function still worked. The landscape was merciless in its indifference. Sage and creosote stretched in all directions, the pale dirt reflecting the sun's heat back at us. The water bottles emptied quickly. By 2 in the afternoon, we were down to 1 bottle among the 4 of us, rationing sips that weren't enough to counter the sweat pouring off us. The silence of the land was absolute. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of wind despite the scrub brush occasionally swaying. Just the crunch of our feet on gravel, our own ragged breathing, and Ben's occasional whimper of pain. After 5 hours that felt like 5 years, I saw it. A thin black line shimmering in the distance through the heat distortion. Asphalt. State Road 124. There, I croaked, my throat so dry the word was barely audible. I pointed with a shaking hand. The road. We stumbled the last half mile, our legs cramping, our throats raw. We collapsed onto the shoulder of the highway, a cracked and empty 2-lane road running east-west through nothing, connecting tiny communities that barely appeared on maps. We lay there on the rough ground, too exhausted to even celebrate, just breathing, alive, outside the boundaries of that place. We were incredibly lucky. Less than 20 minutes later, a dusty Ford Ranger slowed and pulled over onto the shoulder. An old rancher with a face like dried leather, wearing a sweat-stained cowboy hat, looked down at us from his window. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't demand explanations. He just saw the state we were in. Sunburned, dehydrated, bloody. One of us half-conscious and made a decision. "Climb in the back," he said simply, his voice gravelly but not unkind. "I'll take you to Grants." He drove us to the sheriff's substation in Grants, a small New Mexico town that serves as a services hub for the rural area. He didn't ask a single question during the drive. When we arrived, he just nodded at us and drove away, never giving us his name. The state police officer who took my report was a young man, maybe 30, with a professional detached air and a uniform that looked like it had been pressed that morning. He listened to my story, his expression unreadable, occasionally writing notes on a form attached to a clipboard. I told him our truck had broken down. I told him we were camping near the El Malpais area. I deliberately kept the location vague, and that the truck wouldn't start. I told him we'd had to walk out. I left out the figures. I left out the symbols. I left out the scratches on Ben's back and the circle drawn in the dirt. What would I have said? How would I have explained it in a way that didn't sound like psychosis or drugs? The officer nodded, his skepticism obvious in the slight tightening around his eyes. "I can give you a ride back to your vehicle, sir," he said, his tone suggesting he expected to find 4 hungover campers who didn't know how to check their fuel gauge or work a manual choke. The drive back was surreal. The officer made small talk about the weather, about how dry it had been, about how the tourist season was slowing down now that school was back in session. I just nodded, my mind a blank wall of exhaustion and residual fear. When we pulled up the dirt track and the campsite came into view, a pit formed in my stomach. It was just a campsite. The tents were half collapsed where we'd abandoned them. The cooler sat by the dead fire pit, undisturbed. My truck was parked exactly where I'd left it, the camping gear visible in the bed. The morning sun illuminated everything with perfect clarity. The air was clear and light, carrying the normal desert smell of sage and dust. The oppressive, heavy atmosphere from the night before was completely gone. I got out of the patrol car, my legs unsteady, barely supporting my weight. I looked at the ground around the truck, at the dirt where I'd seen the circle, where Maya had pointed out the impossible symbols carved into the earth. The dirt was smooth, wind-scoured, unmarked. The intricate circle, the disturbing symbols, they had vanished completely. There was no trace they had ever been there. No marks, no depressions, no scratches in the hard-packed earth. Nothing. "Well," the officer said, his arms crossed, leaning against his patrol car. "Going to try starting it?" I walked to my truck on numb legs, my movements automatic. I slid into the driver's seat, the familiar smell of the cab doing nothing to soothe me. I put the key in the ignition, fully expecting the same dead result I'd gotten a dozen times during the night. I turned the key. The engine roared to life on the very first turn. It idled perfectly, the sound deafening in the morning quiet, every cylinder firing smoothly. The oil pressure gauge came up. The temperature was normal. Everything was functioning exactly as it should. The officer gave me a look that was a mixture of pity and annoyance. The expression of someone who'd wasted his morning on tourists who didn't know how to work their own equipment. "Sometimes you just gotta let it rest overnight," he said, as if offering a piece of folk wisdom. "Vapor lock, maybe. Heat of the day." He followed me back to the main road, then turned off with a brief wave, leaving us alone. The drive back to Albuquerque was conducted in a thick, suffocating silence. The radio stayed off. No one suggested food or bathroom breaks. We just drove, the highway disappearing under the truck's wheels, putting miles between us and that place. The easy camaraderie we'd shared just 2 days before was gone, destroyed utterly. It had been replaced by a shared trauma that was too monstrous to put into words, too far outside normal experience to discuss. We never properly spoke of it again. The group shattered in the weeks that followed. Ben quit his job at the engineering firm where he'd worked for 6 years. He left without notice, just stopped showing up. The last I heard, about a month after we got back, he was living with his parents in Rio Rancho, diagnosed with severe agoraphobia by a psychiatrist who probably thought Ben had suffered some kind of nervous breakdown. He refused to go outside. The scratches on his back healed into thin white scars, 3 parallel lines from shoulder blade to lower ribs, perfectly straight and evenly spaced. He would carry them forever, physical proof of something that shouldn't have been able to happen. Chloe and I broke up 6 weeks later. It wasn't dramatic. There was no fight, no accusations. We just couldn't be around each other anymore. Every time we looked at each other, we saw the terror reflected in the other's eyes. We saw the memory of that night, of the figures, of the circle, of the absolute certainty that we were going to die out there. The relationship couldn't survive that. The trust was gone. Not trust in each other, but trust in the world itself, in the basic reliability of reality. That loss had hollowed us both out. Maya changed her major at UNM. She'd been in anthropology, specializing in southwestern indigenous cultures, planning on fieldwork and research. She switched to archival studies, choosing the quiet, predictable safety of library basements and climate-controlled storage rooms over ever setting foot in the field again. The last time I saw her, by chance in a coffee shop near campus, she looked haunted. She saw me. Our eyes met, and she turned and left without saying a word. We both understood. There was nothing to say. As for me, the engineer, the man of logic and reason, the person who believed that reality operated on comprehensible principles, my world was broken. The simple mechanical fact of my truck refusing to start and then starting again was an impossibility I could not reconcile. Everything I understood about engines, about combustion, about cause and effect said that if the battery was good and the starter was working, the engine would fire. But it hadn't. For hours it had refused, and then with a state police officer watching, it had worked perfectly. The symbols in the dirt that vanished. The figure that dispersed into shadow. The wounds on Ben's back that appeared from nothing. None of it could be true. All of it was true. I had seen it. I had experienced it. The world no longer operated on the principles I understood, and if those principles were wrong, then I had no foundation, no way to interpret reality, no tools to navigate existence. New Mexico, the place where I was born and raised, the landscapes I had loved for their stark beauty and their seeming purity, now felt alien and threatening. I couldn't drive past the Sandia Mountains without thinking about what might exist in the spaces between, in the areas that weren't marked on maps, in the places that indigenous communities knew to avoid. I couldn't look at the desert without wondering what old rules still applied there, what laws predated human understanding. 6 months after that weekend, 6 months of bad sleep and increasing dissociation, of avoiding any place that wasn't urban and well lit, I made a decision. I sold my truck to a dealer for less than it was worth, because I couldn't stand to be in it. I put in for a transfer with my company's European division, citing a desire for international experience. I took a position with an engineering firm in Munich, Germany. I left the vast open spaces of the Southwest for the old human-built certainty of Europe. I left the land that stretched farther than you could walk for cities where every square meter had been mapped and claimed and built upon for 1,000 years. I left the desert silence for the constant urban noise. I have not been back to New Mexico since. Sometimes, late at night in my apartment in Munich, I pull up satellite view on my computer. I look at that part of New Mexico, at the area west of Albuquerque, at the spaces between Laguna and Tacoma. I zoom in until I can see individual mesas, individual roads. I look at the patch of pale sandstone where we camped. I know exactly where it is. I still have the coordinates in a file somewhere, a meaningless speck in a sea of brown and green. The wind and rain have smoothed over our tire tracks by now, certainly. The land shows no evidence we were ever there. It remains quiet and undisturbed under the vast empty sky, looking exactly as it did before we arrived, exactly as it will look for centuries to come. The land holds its silence. The boundaries remain, marked or unmarked. The trespassers are gone, scattered across the country, broken in different ways by the same experience. And the land endures, keeping its laws, keeping its secrets, waiting with an infinite patience that we can never understand. Late summer in 1992, and I'd finally convinced my girlfriend Lauren to join me for a hike through the wilderness area up near Mount Rainier. We'd been dating close to a year by then, and she wasn't exactly the outdoorsy type, but she humored me because she knew it mattered. The plan was straightforward. A day hike, maybe 6 or 7 miles round trip through a dense stretch of forest I'd read about in a weathered guidebook I'd picked up at a yard sale. We packed light that morning. Just water bottles, a couple of sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, and a folded map that already had creases worn through from too much handling by previous owners. We hit the trail just after sunrise, when the air still held that pre-dawn coolness and the sky stretched out above us in sheets of cloudless blue. The trailhead was empty. No other cars in the dirt lot. No signs of recent hikers. Just us in the forest waiting ahead. I remember feeling excited about that. Having the whole place to ourselves felt like an adventure, like we were explorers charting unknown territory. Lauren gave me this half smile when I said that, the kind that told me she thought I was being dramatic but found it endearing anyway. It started off easy enough. A dirt path cutting through towering trees. Douglas firs mostly, their trunks thick enough that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. The air tasted clean, almost sharp in my lungs, and the forest was quiet except for the soft crunch of our boots on the packed earth, and the occasional chirp of a bird somewhere high in the canopy. We didn't talk much at first, just walked side by side, settling into the rhythm of it. My hand found hers after the first mile, and she squeezed back. About an hour in, the trail got rougher. It narrowed considerably, winding deeper into the woods where the trees grew closer together, their branches interlocking overhead to create a living ceiling that filtered the sunlight into dim greenish columns. The temperature dropped a few degrees in that deeper shade, and I noticed Lauren rubbing her arms even though she'd worn a long-sleeved shirt. The path twisted and turned, following the natural contours of the land. We climbed over fallen logs, their bark soft and crumbling with rot. Mushrooms sprouted from the dead wood in clusters, white ones, brown ones, some with caps the color of rust. I didn't know enough about fungi to identify them, but they added to the sense that we'd entered a different world, one that operated by older rules. We reached the creek around mid-morning. It was maybe 10 feet wide, shallow enough to see the rocky bottom through water so clear it looked almost invisible. Halfway across, her boot slipped on a wet stone. For a heart-stopping second, I thought she'd go down, but I held on and she caught herself, letting out this quick, nervous laugh that echoed off the trees on both sides of the creek. We made it to the other bank and stood there a moment, both breathing a bit harder, and she looked at me with that defiant expression she got when she didn't want to admit something had scared her. "That wasn't so bad," she said, but her voice carried a slight tremor. "You did great," I told her, and I meant it. The relief I felt seeing her starting to enjoy herself, even in these small moments, made the whole trip worthwhile. Or so I thought then. The woods on the far side of the creek felt different. Denser somehow, even though the trees weren't necessarily closer together. The underbrush grew thicker here, ferns and brambles and plants I couldn't name. The trail became less obvious, harder to follow. More than once I had to stop and check the map, making sure we hadn't wandered off course. Around noon, we stopped for a break. There was a fallen log that lay across a small clearing, and we sat on it to eat our sandwiches. The forest had grown quieter, I realized. Fewer bird calls, less rustling in the undergrowth. At the time, I didn't think much of it, figured it was just the heat of the day making the animals sluggish. Lauren's sandwich sat half-eaten in her lap. She kept looking around, scanning the trees with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You okay?" I asked. "Yeah," she said, but she didn't sound convinced. "Just, it feels really isolated out here, doesn't it?" I followed her gaze, seeing what she saw. Trees in every direction, their trunks creating a maze of vertical lines that went on and on. No signs of civilization, no distant sounds of cars or planes, just forest, deep and old and indifferent to our presence. After lunch, the trail climbed a gentle slope. The woods opened up somewhat, fewer trees but more underbrush, and the ground became uneven, forcing us to watch our steps. We'd been walking maybe 3 or 4 hours total when I noticed Lauren starting to lag behind. Her pace had slowed, her breathing heavier. I slowed down too, waiting for her to catch up, and she gave me that same defiant look. "We should probably head back," I said, checking my watch. "Don't want to be out here after dark." She nodded, clearly relieved I'd suggested it first. "Yeah, good idea." We stopped, turned around, and that's when everything changed. We were maybe 10 yards apart, me up ahead, Lauren trailing behind, when she stopped dead. I didn't notice at first, just kept walking. Then I heard her voice, sharp and low, barely above a whisper. "Oh my God." The way she said it made my stomach clench. I turned around, afraid I was about to see her pointing at a bear or a mountain lion. Because Lauren was frozen, absolutely rigid, staring off to her left with the color having drained completely from her face. Her lips had gone pale. I followed her gaze and my jaw dropped. There, about 20 feet off the trail, stood a tree. It was massive, maybe 3 feet thick at the base, and ancient from the look of its gnarled bark. But that wasn't what stopped me cold. Halfway up its trunk at roughly chest height was a deer. Not near the tree, not against it, in it. A full-grown buck, antlers and all, its body impossibly embedded in the solid wood. The front half hung out one side, head tilted downward, eyes glassy and vacant, tongue protruding slightly from its mouth. The back half stuck out the other side, hind legs dangling limp and motionless. The deer's body disappeared into the trunk itself, as if the tree had simply grown around it, absorbing it into its flesh. I stood there, trying to process what I was seeing, trying to make it make sense. It didn't. The tree wasn't broken. There was no splintered bark, no jagged edges where the deer's body met the trunk. The wood looked smooth around it, natural, continuous, as if this was exactly how it was supposed to be, as if the deer belonged there, had always been there. But that was impossible. Trees don't grow around things that fast. And this deer wasn't some ancient skeleton. It looked fresh, recent. There were flies buzzing around its head, but not many, just a few like this had only just happened. No stench of rot filled the air, no maggots writhed in the flesh, no blood stained the bark below. It was just there, fused with the wood in a way that violated every natural law I knew. "Don't," Lauren said, her voice tight. She still hadn't moved. "Don't go closer." But I couldn't help myself. I felt this pull, this overwhelming need to understand what I was looking at. My feet moved forward almost of their own accord. One step, then another, until I stood close enough to reach out and touch the tree if I'd wanted to. Up close it was worse. So much worse. The deer's eye, the one I could see, wasn't completely closed. It stared at nothing, dull and clouded over, but something in that dead gaze made my throat tighten. The fur around its neck looked undisturbed, clean even. No signs of struggle, no torn hide, no indication of violence. Just a deer, impossibly trapped in solid wood. I crouched down, peering at where the body met the trunk. The bark flowed around it seamlessly, molding itself to the contours of the carcass, as if the tree had been liquid once, and then solidified around its prize. I could see individual hairs pressed into the wood grain, preserved there like insects in amber. My hand reached out before I could stop it. My fingers brushed the trunk just below the deer's chest. The bark felt normal, rough, dry, slightly warm from the filtered sunlight. Nothing strange about it until you looked up and saw that abomination protruding from it. "Please," Lauren said behind me, her voice cracking. "Please, we need to leave." I stood up and walked around to the other side. The deer's hindquarters hung there, legs bent at unnatural angles, hooves pointing toward the ground. I looked for signs of entry, for some explanation of how this could have happened. Had it fallen from above? But there were no cliffs nearby, no broken branches overhead. Had someone put it there? But how? You'd have to cut the tree open, insert the deer, and somehow make the wood grow back together. And then it hit me. There was no smell.
Dead animals smell. They rot and decompose and attract scavengers. But this deer, which couldn't have been there long based on its condition, gave off almost no odor at all, just a faint musk, barely noticeable.
That's when the fear really set in. Not the quick jolt of surprise, but something deeper, more primal. My stomach knotted. My hands started trembling. This wasn't just weird or unexplainable. This was wrong on a fundamental level, a violation of something I didn't have words for. The woods had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no breeze rustling the leaves. Just absolute crushing quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what we'd do next. I became acutely aware that we were being watched. Not by anything I could see, but I felt it with absolute certainty. Eyes on us, tracking our movements, weighing our reactions. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My skin crawled. "We're leaving," I said, my voice coming out rougher than intended. Now, we didn't walk back. We practically ran, stumbling over roots and rocks in our haste to put distance between ourselves and that tree. Lauren stayed close behind me, so close I could hear her rapid breathing, feel her panic matching my own. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us dared look back. The trail seemed longer on the return. The trees closer, more oppressive. Shadows stretched across our path despite the afternoon sun. Every snapping twig made us flinch. Every rustle in the undergrowth brought fresh waves of adrenaline. My mind kept replaying what we'd seen, turning it over and over, searching for logical explanations that didn't exist. The image was seared into my brain, that deer hanging there, trapped in wood, its dead eyes staring at nothing. Impossible, unnatural, wrong. We reached the creek and splashed through it without bothering to use the stones. Cold water soaked our boots and jeans, but we didn't care. We just needed to keep moving, to get away, to reach the car in the safety of civilization and normalcy. Lauren slipped once, went down on one knee in the water, and I hauled her back up. Her face was streaked with tears. I hadn't noticed her crying. "I'm okay," she gasped. "Keep going." The last mile was a blur. My legs burned. My lungs ached. But we didn't slow down until we burst out of the tree line and saw my car sitting alone in the empty parking lot, exactly where we'd left it that morning, though it felt like days had passed. We made it back to the car in almost half the time it had taken us to hike out. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get them in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I'd never been so grateful for the sound of machinery, for something human-made and understandable. The whole drive home, 45 minutes on winding mountain roads, we didn't say a word to each other. Lauren sat with her arms wrapped around herself, staring out the window but not really seeing anything. I kept my eyes on the road, but my thoughts were back in those woods, circling that tree. When I pulled up to her apartment building, she sat there for a long moment before opening the door. Then she turned to look at me, and her face was still pale, her eyes red-rimmed. "We're not talking about this," she said. Not a question, a statement. Not to each other, not to anyone, ever. I wanted to argue, wanted to say we should report it, tell someone, figure out what the hell we'd seen. But looking at her, at the fear still etched into her features, the trauma of those hours in the woods, I just nodded. "Okay," I agreed. "We never speak of it again." She got out of the car without another word. I watched her walk to her door, unlock it, disappear inside. We broke up 3 months later. Not because of the hike, officially. We told friends we'd grown apart, wanted different things. But I knew the truth. Every time we looked at each other, we remembered. Every moment of silence between us filled with the image of that deer. I've kept my promise, mostly. Haven't told anyone the full story. Haven't gone back to those woods. But that doesn't mean I've forgotten. How could I? Some nights lying awake in the dark, I see it as clearly as if I'm standing right there again. That impossible thing, that deer half in and half out of solid wood, defying every law of nature I've ever known. And the questions haunt me. How long had it been there? How did it get there? Was it alone, or were there others deeper in those woods? Other animals fused with trees in that same inexplicable way. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there. or if the tree finally finished whatever process it had started, pulling the deer completely inside until no trace remained. Or maybe someone else has found it by now, standing where Lauren and I stood, feeling that same cold grip of fear, that same certainty that they've witnessed something they were never meant to see. The worst part isn't the mystery of it. The worst part is the feeling I can't shake even now, 3 decades later. That sense of being watched, of something in those woods taking note of us, marking us somehow. That we disturbed something that should have remained hidden, and now it knows we exist. Lauren was right. We should never have gotten close. We should have turned and run the moment we saw it. But we didn't. And now I carry that deer with me everywhere I go. A splinter of wrongness lodged deep in my mind. A reminder that the world contains horrors we're not equipped to understand, and that some questions are better left unanswered. My name is Everett Larkin, and what happened to me a few years back still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. I am an ordinary guy with a not-so-ordinary hobby. I collect vintage typewriters. Not just any typewriters, but machines with history, with character etched into their worn keys and faded ribbons. You'd be amazed at the stories these old machines can tell if you're willing to listen. Each ding of the carriage return, every faded letter struck into aging paper, speaks of countless words typed by countless hands over decades of use. My wife Darla thinks I'm a bit crazy for it, but she indulges me with the patient understanding that comes from 15 years of marriage. We don't have kids, so we have time and money to spend on weird things like that. Our modest suburban home has slowly transformed into something of a museum, with typewriters from different eras adorning nearly every available surface. It was this passion that led us to that fateful weekend in October. We decided to take a trip to an old cabin in the woods, owned by a friend of mine, Jeremy. He had mentioned there might be some interesting typewriters stored in the attic, remnants of his grandfather's estate that had been gathering dust for decades. I couldn't resist the allure of uncovering a new treasure, especially given his grandfather's reputation as an avid collector of antiques. It was a secluded place, somewhere in the depths of Maine's forested hills, perfect for a weekend away from the hustle and bustle of our city life. The cabin had been in Jeremy's family for generations, tucked away on 100 acres of pristine woodland that had somehow escaped the developer's axe. Darla and I loaded up our car and headed out on a Friday afternoon, the trunk filled with supplies and my restoration kit, just in case we found something worth salvaging. The drive was long, winding through dense forests that seemed to grow more primeval with each passing mile. The late autumn colors were in full display, creating a canopy of red and gold that filtered the afternoon sunlight into strange patterns on the narrow road. The occasional deer crossed our path, their eyes reflecting our headlights as dusk began to settle in. We passed through small towns that grew increasingly sparse until finally, we turned onto a dirt road that seemed to lead straight into the heart of the wilderness. The cabin was rustic, to say the least, a 2-story structure built in the 1920s with weathered cedar shingles and a stone chimney that looked like it had been standing since the beginning of time. Creaky floors, dim lighting, and a musty smell that reminded me of my grandmother's attic permeated every room. The electricity worked, barely, running off an old generator that hummed somewhere behind the house, and the plumbing was functional if temperamental. Darla laughed at my excitement as I practically bounded up the stairs to the attic the moment we arrived, my flashlight beam dancing across the dust motes that swirled in the air. The attic was a treasure trove of old forgotten items, the kind of place that makes a collector's heart race with anticipation. Dusty books with cracked leather spines lined makeshift shelves. Broken furniture created shadowy obstacles in the beam of my flashlight. And yes, a couple of vintage typewriters sat forgotten in the corners. I set to work immediately, cleaning and inspecting them with the reverence of an archaeologist uncovering ancient artifacts. The dust of decades fell away under my careful touch, revealing the stories hidden beneath. One in particular caught my eye. A Remington No. 7, manufactured sometime in the early 1900s. What made it unique were the intricate carvings on its body, delicate scrollwork that I'd never seen on this model before. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, the keys frozen with age and grime, but there was something about it that called to me. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, and as I ran my fingers over the carved patterns, I could have sworn I felt them shift slightly under my touch, though I attributed this to the poor lighting and my overwrought imagination. Saturday morning dawned bright and clear, and Darla suggested we go for a hike. The weather was perfect, crisp and cool, with the kind of autumn air that makes you feel alive, sharp enough to wake you up but not so cold as to be uncomfortable. We packed a small lunch of sandwiches and trail mix, filled our water bottles, and set off on a trail behind the cabin. The forest was dense but beautiful, with ancient trees towering overhead like silent guardians. The path was well marked but clearly hadn't seen much use recently, with fallen leaves covering most of the trail. It was peaceful, with only the sounds of birds and the rustling of leaves to keep us company, though occasionally we would hear something larger moving through the underbrush, just out of sight. We joked and laughed as we walked, feeling a world away from our usual routine of morning commutes and office meetings. The forest had a way of making everything else seem distant and unimportant, as if we had stepped into another time entirely. We found a small clearing for lunch, sitting on a fallen log while sharing our meal and planning future adventures. The shadows of the trees created strange patterns on the forest floor, and more than once I caught myself staring at them, thinking they looked almost like words written in an ancient, forgotten language. We returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, tired but happy, our clothes smelling of pine needles and wood smoke from the small fire we'd built to warm ourselves during lunch. As the sun began to set, a chill settled in the air, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you grateful for solid walls and a roof over your head. Darla went inside to start dinner while I stayed out on the porch, tinkering with the Remington I had found. I had brought it down from the attic, hoping the better light would help me understand its mysterious carvings. I was so engrossed in my work that I didn't notice how quickly the light was fading, the forest growing darker and more oppressive with each passing minute. Just as I was about to head inside, I heard a noise. It was faint but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps on dry leaves. The crack of twigs and the soft rustle of movement that could only be made by something of significant size. I looked around, expecting to see a deer or maybe a stray hiker, but there was nothing. The trees stood silent and still, their branches reaching toward the darkening sky like grasping fingers. A gust of wind stirred the leaves, and for a moment I could have sworn I heard something that sounded like whispered words carried on the breeze. Shrugging it off, I went inside to join Darla for dinner, though the uneasy feeling followed me through the door. The night fell quickly, and with it a sense of unease seemed to settle over the cabin. What had felt cozy during the day now felt claustrophobic in the dark, the windows becoming black mirrors that reflected our movements while hiding whatever might be lurking outside. Darla and I settled in the living room, the fireplace casting flickering shadows on the walls that seemed to dance with a life of their own. We talked about our hike, our plans for the future, and the typewriter I was so excited about. But that sound of footsteps lingered in the back of my mind. The flames in the fireplace began to die down, and the shadows grew longer and darker. The wind had picked up outside, making the old cabin creak and groan like a living thing. We tried to keep our conversation light, but there was an underlying tension that neither of us wanted to acknowledge. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a thud, followed by what sounded like dragging, as if something heavy was being pulled across the floor above us. My heart raced as I lay still, listening intently to the darkness. Darla stirred beside me but didn't wake up, her breathing remaining steady and deep. The sound came again, more distinct this time, and undeniably coming from the attic. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor, grabbed a flashlight, and crept toward the sound. The noise was coming from the attic, growing more distinct with each step I took up the stairs. I cursed under my breath, knowing that the last thing any sane person would do was investigate a creepy attic in the middle of the night. But curiosity and concern got the better of me. After all, it could be a raccoon or some other animal that had found its way inside. I climbed the stairs as quietly as possible, though the old wood groaned under my weight despite my best efforts. When I reached the attic door, I paused, my hand resting on the cold metal of the doorknob. The dragging sound had stopped, replaced by a soft, almost imperceptible rustling, like paper being moved by an invisible hand. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open, the hinges protesting with a long, low creak that seemed to echo through the entire house. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing out of the ordinary at first glance. Everything was as I had left it. Old books, broken furniture, and the remaining typewriter I hadn't brought downstairs. But something felt different. The air heavier somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. I was about to turn back, feeling foolish for letting my imagination run wild, when I noticed something odd about the typewriter's ribbon. The black ribbon, which had been neatly spooled when I left it, was now unraveling. as if someone or something had been typing on it. I approached it cautiously, half expecting something to jump out at me from the shadows that seemed to retreat just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. But there was nothing, just the soft sound of my own breathing and the distant whisper of wind through the trees outside. The typewriter sat innocently on its table, looking exactly as it had earlier, except for that ribbon. I picked up the unspooled ribbon with trembling hands, holding it close to the flashlight beam. The words typed out made no sense at first glance. Random letters and symbols scattered across the black fabric like some sort of cryptic code. Some sequences repeated. HLPME and DNTGO appeared multiple times, as if someone had been frantically typing without proper spacing or punctuation. The ribbon itself felt cold to the touch, much colder than it should have been in the stuffy attic. I carefully rewound it and put it back in place, telling myself it was just an old machine acting up, that the ribbon had simply come loose from age and gravity. But deep down, I knew something was off. The precise patterns of the letters, the way they clustered together. It wasn't random mechanical failure. The next morning, over coffee that tasted unusually bitter despite being made the same way we always did, I told Darla about the noise and the typewriter. She laughed it off, though the sound was hollow and didn't reach her eyes. "You're letting your imagination run wild, Ev," she said, stirring her coffee absently. "Old houses make weird noises. It's probably just the temperature changes affecting the metal parts." Maybe she was right. We spent the day exploring the area, hiking different trails than before, trying to put the night's events out of our minds. But I noticed how Darla kept looking over her shoulder, how she stayed closer to me than usual, her hand often finding mine as we walked. The autumn day was beautiful, with sunlight filtering through the canopy of red and gold leaves. But something felt different from yesterday. The forest seemed less welcoming, the shadows deeper, the silence more oppressive. We came across an old stone wall, half crumbled and covered in moss, that seemed to serve no purpose this deep in the woods. Darla suggested turning back when we found what looked like old survey markers with strange symbols carved into them. Neither of us said it, but we were both relieved to return to the cabin. That evening, we built a fire in the old stone fireplace and made s'mores, trying to recapture the simple joy of a weekend getaway. The flames cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a while we managed to convince ourselves that everything was normal. We talked about mundane things, work, future vacation plans, whether we should finally get that dog Darla had been wanting. But as darkness fell, the uneasy feeling returned, heavier than before. This time Darla felt it too. She mentioned hearing whispers, like distant conversations just on the edge of hearing, coming from somewhere behind the walls. "It's like they're speaking, but I can't quite make out the words," she said, her voice tight with anxiety. I tried to reassure her, but the truth was I'd been hearing them too. They seemed to follow us from room to room, always just quiet enough to make us doubt our own senses. We decided to call it a night early, hoping to shake off the weirdness with sleep. I made sure all the doors and windows were locked, though I couldn't shake the feeling that such precautions were pointless against whatever was happening here. Around 2 a.m. I woke up again. This time not to a sound but to a feeling of being watched. The bedroom was pitch black except for the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains, casting strange patterns on the ceiling. I turned over and saw Darla was awake too, lying perfectly still, staring at the ceiling with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of our breathing. "Hear what?" I asked, though I already knew what she was going to say. "Footsteps," she replied, outside the window. My heart pounded as I listened. Sure enough, there was a faint crunching of leaves, deliberate and slow, as if whatever was out there wanted us to hear it. The steps moved from one window to the next, circling the cabin with terrible patience. I grabbed the flashlight and the baseball bat we'd brought for protection, a precaution that had seemed almost silly when we packed it, and slowly approached the window. The darkness outside was absolute, the kind of deep black that seems to swallow light itself. I saw nothing but the vague outlines of trees and the occasional glint of moonlight on wet leaves. "I'm going to check it out," I said, more to reassure myself than Darla. We both knew I had to investigate, if only to prove to ourselves that there was a rational explanation. "Be careful," she replied, her voice trembling. She didn't try to stop me, but I could feel her fear as palpable as my own. The night air hit me like a physical force when I stepped outside, cold and damp, and somehow much colder than it should have been for October. The flashlight's beam seemed weaker than before, barely penetrating the darkness that pressed in from all sides. I moved cautiously around the cabin, every sound amplified in the silence. The crunch of leaves under my feet, the soft whisper of wind through the trees, and something else, something that sounded almost like breathing coming from just beyond the reach of my light. As I rounded the corner of the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the damp earth, perfectly formed and unmistakably human, led away from the cabin into the woods. They weren't the hiking boot prints Darla and I had left earlier. These were bare feet, pressed deep into the soil as if whatever made them carried great weight. The stride was too long to be natural, the impressions too sharp in the soft ground. Against every instinct for self-preservation, I followed them, my heart thundering in my chest. The footprints led deeper into the forest, away from the safety of the cabin's warm lights. I should have turned back. Everything I'd ever learned about horror movies and common sense screamed at me to return to Darla and leave this place immediately. But something compelled me forward, as if the force that had been watching us all weekend was now physically pulling me towards some inevitable confrontation. The footprints ended at a clearing I hadn't noticed during our daytime explorations, where an old decrepit shed stood in stark silhouette against the star-filled sky. The shed looked ancient, far older than the cabin, its wooden planks warped and twisted by countless seasons of rain and snow. The roof had partially caved in on one side, creating a jagged hole that resembled a gaping mouth. What struck me most was how wrong it looked. Not just old or abandoned, but fundamentally out of place, as if it had been transplanted from somewhere else entirely. Dark stains ran down the walls like tears, and the door hung askew on rusted hinges that creaked softly in the night breeze. I approached the shed, the flashlight beam revealing more footprints around the entrance, overlapping each other in chaotic patterns. Some led in, none led out. The air grew noticeably colder as I neared the structure, and that musty smell I'd noticed in the cabin was stronger here, mixed with something else, a sharp metallic odor that reminded me of old pennies. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I had to know what was going on. The baseball bat felt inadequate in my sweating hands as I pushed the door open, wincing at the loud groan of protesting hinges. The smell hit me first. Decay and dampness, a combination that made my stomach turn. It was the smell of old death and wet earth, of things that should remain buried. I shone the flashlight around, revealing old tools hanging on the walls, their edges dark with what I hoped was rust. Broken furniture lay scattered about as if thrown by some tremendous force, and what looked like animal bones were scattered across the dirt floor. But it was what lay in the corner that turned my blood to ice. A figure huddled there, shrouded in darkness. Even my flashlight seemed reluctant to penetrate. "Who's there?" I demanded, trying to keep the fear from my voice. The figure didn't move at first, but I could hear ragged breathing, wet and labored. I took a step closer, the beam of the flashlight finally illuminating a face that would haunt my nightmares for years to come. It was a man, or what was left of one. His skin was a pale gray, stretched tight over sharp bones like paper left too long in the sun. His eyes were sunken and hollow, but they reflected the flashlight beam with an unnatural amber glow. What little remained of his clothes hung in tatters, stained dark with substances I didn't want to identify. He looked at me with a mixture of fear and desperation that seemed somehow worse than any aggression could have been. "Help me," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping across stone. Despite the cold, sweat ran down my back as I stood frozen in place. "What happened to you?" I managed to ask, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. His cracked lips moved soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice again. "They're coming," he said, his words tumbling out faster now, more urgent. "They're coming for you, just like they came for me. The typewriter, it's their way in. Their gateway. You have to destroy it before..." Before he could finish, his whole demeanor changed. His body tensed, and those amber eyes suddenly blazed with an internal light. "Too late," he growled, but it wasn't his voice anymore. The sound was deeper, resonating with something ancient and malevolent. He lunged at me with impossible speed, fingers curved into claws, mouth open to reveal teeth that had been filed to sharp points. I swung the baseball bat purely on instinct, connecting solidly with his chest. There was a sound like breaking branches, and he fell back, gasping for breath. The impact felt wrong, too solid and too hollow at the same time, as if what I'd struck wasn't entirely physical. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I turned and ran, the flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I sprinted back toward the cabin. Branches whipped at my face and roots seemed to reach up to grab my feet, but terror gave me speed I didn't know I possessed. I burst through the cabin door, slamming it behind me and throwing the deadbolt. Darla was waiting in the living room, her face pale with fear. "What happened?" she asked, though I think she could read the answer in my expression. "There's a man in the shed," I gasped, trying to catch my breath. He's not right. Something's wrong with him. With this whole place." Even as I spoke, we could hear movement outside. Not just footsteps now, but a soft scratching at the walls, as if multiple somethings were testing the cabin's defenses. We barricaded the door and windows, our hearts pounding with fear. The rest of the night passed in a blur of whispers and distant footsteps, as if the forest itself was alive and watching us. The sounds circled the cabin endlessly, sometimes coming right up to the windows, sometimes retreating into the distance only to return again. Neither of us slept. We sat in the living room, clutching each other's hands, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. When dawn finally came, we didn't wait to pack properly. We threw our essential belongings into bags and ran for the car. As we loaded our things, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by countless unseen eyes. Darla felt it too. I could tell by the way she kept looking over her shoulder, her hands shaking as she tried to help me with the bags. We didn't talk much on the drive back, the silence heavy with fear and confusion. Each mile we put between ourselves and the cabin felt like escaping from a nightmare, but somehow I knew it wasn't over. When we got home, we tried to put the whole experience behind us. We went back to our normal routines, never speaking about what had happened that weekend. But the memories lingered, the feeling of unease never quite leaving. I couldn't look at my typewriter collection without remembering the night in the cabin, the man in the shed, and the whispers in the darkness. I started selling off my collection, piece by piece, until only a few remained. A few weeks later, I received a call from Jeremy. He sounded frantic, his words tumbling over each other in his haste to get them out. "Everett, you need to come back," he said, his voice cracking with stress. "There's something you need to see." My heart sank at his words. "What is it?" I asked, already knowing I wouldn't like the answer. "Just come, please." Reluctantly, I agreed. I didn't tell Darla. I couldn't bear to see the fear return to her eyes. I made the drive alone, the memories of our last visit replaying in my mind like a horror movie I couldn't turn off. When I arrived, Jeremy was waiting outside the cabin, his face pale and drawn. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, dark circles under his eyes making him look much older than his years. "Jeremy, what's going on?" I asked as I got out of the car. He didn't answer, just led me inside. The cabin looked the same, but there was an air of tension, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Jeremy took me to the attic and pointed to the typewriter, the same Remington No. 7 I had been so excited about during our first visit. "Look," he said, his voice shaking. I approached the typewriter, my heart pounding in my chest. The ribbon was spooled neatly, but there were fresh words typed out on a piece of paper still held in the roller. They weren't random letters this time, but a coherent message that made my blood run cold. "Leave now, before it's too late. They're choosing another." I stared at the words, my mind racing. "Jeremy, did you do this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. He shook his head slowly. "I found it like this yesterday morning. The paper wasn't here the night before. I think the cabin is haunted. Or maybe it's something worse than ghosts." I thought about the man in the shed, about his warning regarding the typewriter. "We need to leave," I said, my voice firm. "Whatever is going on, it's not safe here." Jeremy nodded, relief flooding his face at having someone else validate his fears. We left the cabin that day, locking the door behind us. I didn't look back, and neither did Jeremy. We drove away in silence, the weight of the experience heavy on our minds. In the months that followed, I tried to move on. I sold the last of my typewriter collection, unable to bear their presence in my home any longer. But the memories of that weekend haunted me. The whispers and footsteps became a constant presence in my dreams. Darla and I never spoke of it again, but sometimes I catch her looking at old typewriters in antique shops with a mixture of fear and sadness, and I know she's remembering too. Jeremy sold the cabin eventually, unable to face whatever lived there. I've thought about trying to warn the new owners, but what would I say? That there's something evil living in the woods, something that uses old typewriters as gateways. That the clicking of keys in the night might mean something is trying to break through. They wouldn't believe me. I barely believe it myself, But sometimes late at night, when the house is quiet except for the settling of old wood and the whisper of wind through the trees, I swear I can hear it. The faint, rhythmic clicking of typewriter keys, spelling out messages from somewhere beyond our understanding. And I lie awake, wondering if somewhere, in some dark corner of the world, another collector is about to discover that some things are better left forgotten, some stories better left untold. My name is Bryce Truen, and this story happened to me back in 2012. I was 27 then, a freelance graphic designer living in Cleveland, Ohio, struggling to make ends meet in the aftermath of the 2008 recession. My tiny apartment in Ohio City was cluttered with half-finished projects and empty coffee cups, a testament to the long nights I spent trying to meet client deadlines. The student loans from Kent State hung over my head like a dark cloud, and the irregular income from freelancing meant I was constantly juggling bills, deciding which ones could wait another week. Every morning I'd wake up to an inbox full of potential clients wanting miracles on shoestring budgets, and every night I'd fall asleep to the soft glow of my computer screen, pushing pixels around until my eyes burned. Jackson and I had been friends since our sophomore year at Kent State, where we bonded over late-night study sessions and a shared love for the outdoors. He was the kind of friend who could read your mood from a single text message, always showing up with either a six-pack or a hiking plan when things got rough. Unlike me, he had managed to secure a stable IT job at a local healthcare company, complete with benefits and regular hours. But even with his steady paycheck, the corporate grind was wearing him down. I could see it in the way his shoulders slumped during our weekly meetups at Great Lakes Brewing Company, where we'd commiserate over craft beers and reminisce about simpler times. When he suggested a weekend getaway to his family's cabin in the Allegheny National Forest, it felt like a lifeline being thrown to a drowning man. The drive to Pennsylvania was a gradual descent into isolation, each mile taking us further from the familiar comfort of civilization. Jackson's old Jeep Cherokee, a vehicle he'd stubbornly kept since college despite its numerous mechanical quirks, carried us along winding roads that seemed to grow narrower and more overgrown with each passing hour. We had packed enough supplies to last a week, groceries from Westside Market, a cooler full of Great Lakes beer, camping gear that still smelled of previous adventures, and our laptops, though Jackson assured me we wouldn't need them. The late afternoon sun filtered through the dense canopy of oak and maple trees, creating dancing shadows on the dashboard as we swapped stories and shared dreams of escaping the rat race. The cabin revealed itself gradually through the trees, a sturdy structure of weathered logs and stone that had stood watch over the lake for 3 generations of Jackson's family. The front porch sagged slightly under the weight of memories, its wooden boards worn smooth by countless footsteps. A small dock extended into the lake like a finger pointing toward the horizon, its planks bleached silver by countless summers. The water was mirror smooth, reflecting the surrounding forest with such precision that it was hard to tell where reality ended and reflection began. We unpacked with the enthusiasm of escaped prisoners, each item we brought in making the cabin feel more like our temporary sanctuary. That first evening set the tone for what we thought would be a perfect weekend. We grilled thick ribeye steaks we'd splurged on at Ohio City Provisions, seasoned simply with salt and pepper, letting the wood smoke add its own layer of flavor. The beer was cold, the conversation easy, and the stars were incredible. Away from Cleveland's light pollution, the night sky revealed itself in all its glory, a vast ocean of pinpricks that made me feel simultaneously insignificant and part of something immense. We talked about everything and nothing, failed relationships, career aspirations, the weird comfort of being lost in creative work, and the growing feeling that we were somehow falling behind in life despite working harder than ever. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that belongs in a calendar photo. After a breakfast of coffee and bacon sandwiches, we set out to explore, following a trail that Jackson remembered from childhood visits. The forest was alive with sound and movement, chickadees flitting between branches, squirrels chattering their disapproval of our presence, and the constant whisper of leaves in the breeze. The trail wound through stands of ancient hemlocks, their trunks straight as columns, their branches creating a cathedral-like canopy overhead. The waterfall, when we found it, was a 30-foot cascade of crystal-clear water that splashed into a pool of liquid amber. It was on our way back from the waterfall that we first noticed something was wrong. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming in the morning light, had taken on a different character. The shadows between the trees seemed deeper, more purposeful somehow. I was the first to notice the markings. 3 parallel gouges carved deep into the bark of an ancient oak tree, each groove wide enough to fit my thumb. They started about 7 feet up the trunk and raked downward for nearly 3 feet, cutting through the thick bark like it was butter. As a city kid, my knowledge of wildlife was limited to National Geographic documentaries and the occasional deer spotted in the metro parks, but even I knew these weren't typical bear markings. "Hey Jackson," I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the forest. "Come take a look at this." He backtracked to where I stood, his boots crunching on fallen leaves. The moment he saw the markings, his usual easygoing expression faltered. I watched as he ran his fingers along the gouges, measuring their depth and spacing with the methodical precision I'd seen him apply to debugging code. "That's unusual," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Must be a really big bear." But the way his eyes darted between the trees, scanning the deepening shadows, told me he didn't believe his own explanation. As we continued back toward the cabin, we found more trees marked in the same way, always in sets of 3, always impossibly high up the trunk. Each set of markings seemed to be pointing in the same direction, leading deeper into the forest where the underbrush grew thick and uninviting. That evening, the cabin felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fragile shell of wood and stone. We built a fire in the stone pit outside, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to recapture the easy camaraderie of the previous night. But our conversation kept circling back to the markings, to the unnatural quiet that had fallen over the forest, to the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in our surroundings. The jokes we made about local cryptids and Blair Witch projects had an edge of nervousness to them, our laughter a little too loud, a little too quick. The first sound came just after sunset, a low resonant call that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not quite a howl, not quite a roar, but something in between that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was the kind of sound that bypassed rational thought and went straight to the primitive part of the brain, the part that knows when it's being hunted. Jackson and I exchanged glances over the dying fire, neither of us willing to be the first to acknowledge what we'd heard. The second call came closer, accompanied by the sound of breaking branches somewhere in the darkness beyond the cabin's small circle of light. We retreated inside, securing the door with a speed that would have been comical under other circumstances. The cabin's windows suddenly seemed too large, too fragile, each one a potential entry point for whatever was moving through the forest outside. We spent the next few hours sitting in the main room, nursing our beers and trying to convince ourselves that every crack and groan of the cabin's old timber frame was just the natural settling of wood. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and shallow. I dozed in fits and starts, each time jerking awake to the sound of movement outside. The footsteps were the worst part, deliberate and heavy, circling the cabin with a patience that seemed almost calculating. They would stop occasionally, and in those moments of silence I could swear I heard breathing, deep and rhythmic, just on the other side of the wall. I wanted to wake Jackson, to share the burden of fear that was pressing down on my chest, but each time I looked over at his sleeping bag, some instinct kept me quiet. Morning brought weak sunlight and a false sense of security. Over coffee that we both pretended wasn't our third cup, Jackson and I tried to rationalize the events of the night. Maybe it was a bear, we said. Maybe a bobcat. Maybe the isolation and darkness had played tricks on our minds, transforming ordinary forest sounds into something more sinister. But we both knew we were lying to ourselves. What we'd heard wasn't natural, and the markings we'd found weren't made by any animal we knew of. We decided to spend the day on the lake, putting as much distance between ourselves and the forest as possible. Jackson's family kept an old aluminum rowboat tied to the dock, and we spent hours fishing in the deep water at the center of the lake. The activity helped, giving us something to focus on besides our growing unease. We even managed to catch a few smallmouth bass, their scales glinting like copper in the afternoon sun. But as the day wore on, I noticed Jackson watching the shoreline more than his fishing line, his eyes tracking something in the dense undergrowth that I couldn't see. The sun was setting by the time we pulled the boat back to the dock, casting long shadows across the water. The fish we'd caught made a decent meal, but neither of us could fully enjoy it. The forest had gone quiet again, that unnatural silence that seems to precede something terrible. We were cleaning up the dinner dishes when the first crash came, a violent impact that shook the entire cabin, sending our remaining beers toppling from the counter. It sounded like something massive had thrown itself against the outer wall, testing the strength of our shelter. The impact left us frozen in place, dish towels still in our hands, water running unnoticed in the sink. Then came another crash, this one against the back wall near the bedroom. Jackson grabbed a heavy Maglite flashlight from the counter, the kind police officers carry, solid aluminum that could double as a weapon. I armed myself with the closest thing at hand, an old cast iron skillet that had probably been in the cabin since his grandparents' time. We stood back to back in the kitchen, listening to whatever it was methodically testing each wall of the cabin. "We need to get to the Jeep," Jackson whispered, his voice tight with controlled fear. "Keys are on the hook by the door. When I say run, we make a break for it." I nodded, not trusting my voice. The thing outside had gone quiet, but that silence was somehow worse than the crashes had been. My hands were sweating on the skillet's handle, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. The attack, when it came, was from an unexpected direction. There was a splintering crack from above, and the entire ceiling seemed to bow inward as something massive landed on the cabin's roof. We could hear claws. There was no mistaking them for anything else now, scrabbling against the wooden shingles. Jackson shoved me toward the door. "Run, now!" We burst out onto the porch, Jackson's flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the edge of the light, a massive shape dropping from the roof, something that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. But there wasn't time to process what I'd seen. We sprinted toward the Jeep, our feet pounding against the dirt driveway. We were halfway there when Jackson swore. "My phone. The GPS is on it. We'll never find our way out without it." Before I could stop him, he turned back toward the cabin. "Get in the Jeep. I'll be right there." I reached the vehicle, yanking open the driver's side door and scrambling inside. The keys were still in my hand, shaking so badly it took 3 tries to get them in the ignition. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the darkness. I watched Jackson disappear into the cabin, the beam of his flashlight visible through the windows. 1 minute passed, 2. The silence stretched out, broken only by the idle of the Jeep's engine. Come on," I muttered, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. Then I heard it. A scream that didn't sound entirely human, followed by the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. The flashlight beam inside the cabin went wild, swinging erratically before going dark. Without thinking, I jumped out of the Jeep. "Jackson!" I took 2 steps toward the cabin before something grabbed me from behind. The grip was impossibly strong, like being caught in an industrial vice. I could feel claws pressing against my back, not quite breaking the skin. A warning. Pure instinct took over. I threw my head back, feeling it connect with something solid, and the grip loosened just enough. I twisted free, feeling cloth and skin tear, and ran. Not toward the Jeep. Whatever had grabbed me was between me and the vehicle now, but into the forest. I crashed through underbrush, branches whipping against my face, my lungs burning. Behind me I could hear movement, something large following me through the trees, but not at full speed. It was toying with me. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing near a small stream. The rocky ground was damp against my face as I lay there, trying to breathe without making a sound. The forest had gone silent again, that same unnatural quiet from before. I stayed there for what felt like hours, listening for any sign of pursuit. When nothing came, I began the slow process of getting my bearings. The moon had risen, providing just enough light to navigate by. I oriented myself using the stream, remembering it had flowed past the east side of the cabin. Moving as quietly as possible, I made my way back, clinging to the desperate hope that Jackson had somehow gotten away, that I'd find him waiting by the Jeep with some wild story about hiding from whatever had attacked us. The cabin, when I finally found it, was dark and silent. The front door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. Inside, furniture had been overturned. Claw marks scored deep into the wooden floors and walls. There was no sign of Jackson or his flashlight. The Jeep was gone too, though I hadn't heard it start up during my flight through the woods. Dawn found me stumbling into Miller's Diner, a small roadside establishment in the nearest town. I must have looked like something out of a horror movie. Clothes torn, face scratched, covered in dirt and leaves. The elderly waitress behind the counter took one look at me and reached for the phone, calling the local police before even asking what had happened. The next few weeks passed in a blur of police interviews, search parties, and endless questions. They found the Jeep 3 miles from the cabin, pulled off to the side of the forest road. driver's door open and keys still in the ignition. There were deep scratches in the paint on the driver's side, and the rear tire was shredded as if something had tried to prevent it from leaving. Of Jackson, there was no sign. The official search lasted 3 weeks. Teams with dogs combed the forest. Helicopters with thermal imaging swept the area, and local volunteers covered every inch of ground they could reach. They found nothing. No clothing, no blood, no sign of what had happened that night. The police report eventually listed it as a probable animal attack, though they could never explain the claw marks in the cabin or the strange prints found around the property that didn't match any known species. I moved back to Cleveland, taking a steady job at a design firm in the warehouse district. The regular paycheck and structured hours helped keep the memories at bay, but they never fully went away. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects, staying late at the office, anything to avoid the quiet moments when my mind would drift back to that night in the forest. The nightmares came regularly at first, vivid recreations of the attack that would leave me gasping awake in a cold sweat. Over time, they became less frequent but never completely stopped. 3 years after Jackson's disappearance, I met Anna at a company event. She was different from anyone I'd dated before. Patient, understanding, and somehow able to sense when the memories were weighing heavily on me. I told her about Jackson gradually, sharing pieces of the story over time, though I never could bring myself to tell her everything I'd seen that night. We bought a small house in Lakewood, started talking about marriage and kids, and for a while I thought I might finally be able to put the past behind me. Then the journal arrived. It came in a plain brown package with no return address, just my name and address written in unfamiliar handwriting. Inside was a leather-bound notebook, its pages water-stained and dirty but still readable. I recognized Jackson's distinctive scrawl immediately, and my hands shook as I opened it. The journal entries started normally enough. Plans for our weekend, notes about the cabin's maintenance needs, sketches of the lake and surrounding forest. But as I read on, I discovered that Jackson had known more than he'd let on. He wrote about research he'd done into the area's history, about other disappearances over the years that had never made the news. There were detailed sketches of the claw marks we'd found, accompanied by measurements and comparisons to known predators, none matched. The final entry was dated the night before he disappeared. The usually neat handwriting was rushed, almost frantic. Found something today. A cave system, about 3 miles northeast of the cabin. The markings all seemed to lead there. Local tribes avoided this area, called it the Place of Long Sleep. Need to check it out tomorrow. Whatever's out there, it's been here a long time. Too long. If anything happens to me, the cave is the key. Remember, northeast, follow the marks, be careful. The journal arrived 6 months ago. Since then I've been preparing, gathering supplies and training. Anna thinks I'm crazy for even considering going back. And maybe I am. But I owe it to Jackson, to his family, to find out what happened that night. I'm writing this now from a new cabin, one we rented about 5 miles from where it all happened. There are 4 of us this time. Me, 2 experienced hunters named Mike and Steve, and a local guide named Ray who knows these woods better than anyone. We're armed this time, not just with guns but with cameras, GPS units and satellite phones. Tomorrow morning we head northeast, following Jackson's directions to the cave. The thing is, since we arrived, we've been hearing noises at night. The same noises. And this morning we found fresh claw marks on the trees around camp. Whatever took Jackson is still out there, and I think it knows we're coming. This might be my last chance to tell our story. If you're reading this and something happens to us, stay away from the Allegheny Forest. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. Final update. Found among the personal effects of Bryce Trewin, recovered near the entrance of a previously unmapped cave system in the Allegheny National Forest. We found the cave. And we found Jackson, or what was left of him. The bones were scattered across the cave floor, along with others, dozens of others. Some looked ancient, others more recent. As we were documenting the scene, we heard it, that same sound from 12 years ago. The others ran for the entrance. I stayed behind to gather what I could of Jackson's remains. That's when I saw it clearly for the first time, in the beam of my flashlight. I understand now why the local tribes avoided this place, why the forest goes quiet when it hunts. This isn't just its hunting ground, it's its home, and has been for centuries. I can hear it moving closer. The others are long gone, and my flashlight is dying. At least Jackson's family will know what happened to him. As for me, I finally have my answers. though I doubt I'll live to share them. If you find this, burn it. Burn the journal. Lock up this cave. Some things should stay buried in the dark where they belong. End of document. The remainder of the pages were found to be stained with material currently undergoing forensic analysis. The cave entrance has since been sealed by order of the U.S. Forest Service, citing environmental hazards. This happened in the summer of 1986. I was 28 years old at the time, fresh out of graduate school, and eager to make my mark as a writer. My name is Claire Whitaker, and the events I'm about to recount still haunt me to this day. I had just finalized a messy breakup with my long-term boyfriend, and was looking for a way to clear my head while working on my first book, a collection of folklore about California's stranger places. If I had known what I was walking into, I would have picked anywhere else. But fate, or perhaps something darker, drew me to Mono Lake that summer. The drive from San Francisco to Mono Lake took about 6 hours, but it felt like entering another world. As I guided my weathered RV along Highway 395, the lush coastal landscape gave way to the stark beauty of the eastern Sierra. Jagged peaks loomed in the distance, their snow-capped summits a startling contrast to the arid basin below. Mono Lake itself was a sight to behold. As I approached, the shimmering expanse of water stretched out before me, surrounded by a landscape that seemed more alien than earthly. Eerie limestone formations known as Tufa Towers jutted from the lake's surface and shoreline, their twisted shapes resembling petrified creatures frozen in time. I chose a quiet campsite near the South Tufa area, far from the more popular tourist spots. The isolation was exactly what I needed, or so I thought at the time. As I maneuvered my RV into place, the only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath the tires and the distant cry of gulls. Setting up camp didn't take long. I had everything I needed: a small propane stove, a folding table for my typewriter, and enough food and water to last a week. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the surreal landscape, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. This was the perfect place to write, I thought. No distractions, no painful memories, just me and the ancient lake. That first evening, as I sat outside my RV sipping instant coffee and watching the stars emerge, I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A park ranger's truck pulled up, its headlights cutting through the growing darkness. The ranger who stepped out was a man in his early 40s, with a weathered face and a no-nonsense demeanor that seemed to fit the harsh landscape. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat. "Just doing my rounds. You planning on staying a while?" I nodded, introducing myself and explaining my writing project. The ranger, who introduced himself as Robert, listened with interest, but I couldn't help noticing a flicker of concern in his eyes. "It's an interesting place, Mono Lake," he said carefully. "Lots of history here, some of it not so pleasant." I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Robert hesitated, as if debating how much to say. "Let's just say this place has a history. People hear things, see things. Some don't come back." I laughed nervously, assuming he was trying to scare the out-of-towner. "Thanks for the warning." He gave me a long, searching look before saying, "Just be careful, especially after dark. And if you need anything, I patrol this area most evenings." As Robert drove away, his words stuck with me, but I brushed them aside. I had a book to write, after all, and I wasn't about to let some local superstition derail my plans. That night I slept fitfully, my dreams filled with shadowy figures and the sound of lapping water. I woke several times, convinced I had heard singing drifting across the lake, but when I strained my ears there was only silence. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the harsh sunlight revealing the lake in all its alien beauty. I spent the day hiking around the shore, taking notes and photographs for my book. The landscape was mesmerizing, vast stretches of alkali flats, punctuated by the bizarre tufa formations and the shimmering water of the lake itself. As I explored, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. More than once I spun around, certain I had seen movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find myself alone in the vast, empty landscape. By late afternoon, I had gathered enough material to start writing in earnest. I returned to my campsite, made a simple dinner of canned soup, and settled in at my typewriter as the sun began to set. The words flowed easily at first. I wrote about the geological history of Mono Lake, its unique ecosystem, and the Native American legends associated with the area. But as night fell and the temperature dropped, I found my thoughts drifting to darker topics. I began writing about the more sinister legends I had uncovered in my research. Stories of spirits trapped in the alkaline waters, of shadowy figures that lured unwary travelers to their doom. Some believed the lake was a gateway between worlds, a place where the living and the dead brushed shoulders. Just after midnight, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard it. Soft, melodic singing coming from the direction of the Tufa Towers. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. It wasn't wind or an animal. It was human, or close enough to sound like it. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The night was clear, the stars blazing overhead with an intensity I had never seen in the city. The singing continued, faint but persistent. I scanned the shoreline with my light but saw nothing. After a few minutes, the singing stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Shaking my head, I went back inside and locked the door. It was probably just my imagination, I told myself, fueled by the ghost stories I had been writing about. Still, I double-checked the locks before finally falling into an uneasy sleep. The next morning I found something that made my blood run cold. Small, barefoot footprints led from the lake's edge to my campsite. They couldn't have been there long. The wind would have erased them otherwise. I stood there, staring at the prints, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were no children staying nearby. I was the only camper for miles. As I examined the footprints more closely, I noticed something odd. They seemed to fade away as they approached my RV, as if whoever or whatever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the morning trying to rationalize what I had seen and heard. Kids playing a prank, I told myself. Or maybe I was more stressed than I realized, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That afternoon, I hiked to a different part of the lake, hoping a change of scenery would clear my head. The Tufa Towers were even more impressive here, rising from the water like the spires of some drowned cathedral. As I sat on a rock, sketching the scene in my notebook, I saw her for the first time. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, stood at the water's edge about 50 yards away. She wore a pale dress that looked oddly old-fashioned, and her long dark hair was tangled around her face. She didn't seem to notice me at first, just stared out at the lake as if searching for something. "Hey there," I called out, concerned about a child being alone in such a remote area. "Are you okay? Where are your parents?" She turned slowly, her movements deliberate, and looked at me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unnervingly calm. "I can't find them," she said softly. "Can you help me?" I stood up, brushing sand from my jeans, and stepped closer. There was something off about the girl, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Her skin seemed too pale, almost translucent in the harsh sunlight, and her eyes, there was a depth to them that no child should have. "Where did you last see them?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She pointed toward the lake. "They're out there." I frowned, a chill running down my spine despite the heat of the day. "In the water?" She nodded. "I hear them sometimes, singing." My stomach tightened as I remembered the eerie melody I had heard the night before. "What's your name?" I asked, stalling for time as I tried to figure out what to do. "Lily," she said. "Will you help me find them?" Before I could answer, a strong gust of wind whipped across the shore, kicking up a cloud of alkali dust. I raised my arm to shield my eyes, coughing as the acrid particles filled my mouth and nose. When I looked back, Lily was gone. I spent the next hour searching the area, calling out for Lily, but found no trace of her. There were no footprints in the sand, no sign that she had been there at all. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to my campsite, my mind reeling. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Lily's face, her unnaturally calm expression and those deep, knowing eyes. And underneath it all, I could hear the faint echo of singing drifting across the water. The next morning, I drove into the small town of Lee Vining, desperate for human contact and hoping to gather more information about the lake's history. The local diner was nearly empty when I arrived, just a couple of old-timers nursing cups of coffee at the counter. I settled into a booth and ordered breakfast, then struck up a conversation with the waitress, a middle-aged woman named Betty who had lived in the area her whole life. "So you're staying out by the lake?" she asked as she refilled my coffee. Writing a book, you said. I nodded, then hesitated before adding, actually, I was hoping you might be able to help me with some local history. I've heard some strange stories about the lake. Betty's smile faded slightly. What kind of stories? I told her about the singing I had heard, and about my encounter with Lily. As I spoke, I noticed the diner had gone quiet. The old-timers at the counter were listening intently, exchanging knowing glances. When I finished, Betty sighed and sat down across from me. You're not the first person to see her, she said quietly. There's a story been passed down for generations about a girl who drowned in the lake back in the 1930s. They say she and others like her sometimes appear to visitors, especially those who are vulnerable in some way. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean, vulnerable? Betty shrugged. People who are grieving, or lonely, or lost in some way. The story goes that these spirits are trapped in the lake, and they try to lure the living to join them. I laughed nervously, trying to hide my unease. You don't really believe that, do you? One of the old-timers at the counter spoke up. Believe it or not, strange things happen out there. My uncle disappeared near South Tufa back in '62. They never found a trace of him. As I drove back to my campsite, my mind was racing. Part of me wanted to dismiss the stories as local superstition, but I couldn't shake the memory of Lily's otherworldly presence, or the eerie singing I had heard. When I arrived back at my RV, I found Robert, the park ranger, waiting for me. His expression was grim. Miss Whitaker, he said as I approached. I wanted to check in on you. How are you finding your stay? I hesitated, then decided to be honest. I told him about my experiences, the footprints, the singing, and my encounter with Lily. As I spoke, Robert's frown deepened. I was afraid of this, he said when I had finished. You're not the first person to have experiences like this. The lake, it has a way of getting into people's heads. What do you mean? I asked. Robert sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. There's a lot of history here, Miss Whitaker. Not all of it good. The native people who lived here believed the lake was a place of power, a gateway between worlds. And over the years, there have been incidents. He went on to tell me about disappearances, strange sightings, and unexplained phenomena that had occurred around Mono Lake over the decades. As he spoke, I felt a growing sense of unease. I'm not saying I believe in ghosts, Robert said finally, but there's something about this place that defies explanation. My advice? Finish your research and move on. Don't let the lake get its hooks into you. As Robert drove away, I stood there for a long time, staring out at the placid surface of Mono Lake. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. It was beautiful, but now I could see something menacing in its alien landscape. I seriously considered packing up and leaving right then. But the writer in me, the part that had always been drawn to the strange and unexplained, wouldn't let me go. I had come here for a story, and now I had one far more compelling than anything I could have imagined. That night, as I sat at my typewriter, the words poured out of me. I wrote about Lily, about the legends of the lake, about the long history of strange occurrences in the area. As I wrote, I could hear the faint sound of singing drifting across the water, growing louder as the night wore on. Over the next few days, I threw myself into my research with a fervor that bordered on obsession. I spent hours combing through old newspapers at the Lee Vining Library, uncovering a long history of mysterious deaths and disappearances around Mono Lake. One story in particular caught my attention: the drowning of a young girl named Lily Thompson in 1932. The details were sparse, but according to the article, Lily had wandered away from a family picnic and was last seen near the shore. Her body was never found. As I read the faded newsprint, my hands shaking, I knew without a doubt that this was the girl I had seen. But how was that possible? And more importantly, what did she want from me? Each night I returned to my campsite exhausted but unable to sleep. The singing continued, sometimes distant and ethereal, sometimes so close it seemed to be coming from just outside my RV, and always, in the back of my mind, I could hear Lily's voice. Will you help me find them? On my 5th night at Mono Lake, everything changed. I had been working late, transcribing my notes and trying to make sense of the conflicting stories and legends I had uncovered. Around midnight, I stepped outside to clear my head and was struck by the absolute stillness of the night. The usual sounds of the desert, the whisper of wind, The cry of nightbirds were conspicuously absent. Then I saw her. Lily stood at the water's edge, her pale dress glowing in the moonlight. She turned to look at me, and even from a distance I could see the sadness in her eyes. "Please," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the still air. "I need your help." Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself walking towards her. As I got closer, I could see that her feet didn't quite touch the ground, and her form seemed to shimmer and shift in the moonlight. "Lily," I said, my voice trembling, "what happened to you?" She looked out at the lake, her expression wistful. "I got lost," she said simply, "and now I can't find my way back. But you can help me." "How?" I asked, even as a part of me realized the danger I was in. Lily turned back to me, her eyes now glowing with an unnatural light. "Join us," she said, her voice taking on an otherworldly resonance. "In the depths, we're all together. No more loneliness, no more pain." As she spoke, I became aware of other figures emerging from the lake. Shadowy forms, vaguely human but distorted, their eyes glowing with the same eerie light as Lily's. They began to sing, a haunting melody that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding. "No," I gasped, "this isn't real. You're not real." Lily's face contorted with anger, her features becoming less human by the second. "We are more real than anything in your world," she hissed, "and you belong with us." The shadowy figures surged forward, their cold, wet hands grasping at my clothes, my skin. I screamed and fought, but there were too many of them. They began dragging me towards the water, the icy lake lapping at my feet. Just as I was about to be pulled under, a bright light cut through the darkness. The sound of an engine roared across the shore, and suddenly Robert's Ranger truck came barreling towards us, horn blaring. The shadowy figures scattered, dissolving into mist. Lily remained for a moment longer, her eyes locked on mine with a mixture of sorrow and rage, before she too faded away. Robert leapt from the truck, flashlight in hand. "Miss Whitaker," he shouted, rushing to my side. "Are you all right?" I was shaking uncontrollably, soaked and covered in the lake's alkaline mud.
They were real.
I stammered.
Lily, the others, they tried to...
"I know," Robert said grimly, helping me to my feet. "I've seen them too. Come on, let's get you out of here." As we drove away from the lake, I looked back. In the fading lights of the truck, I could have sworn I saw figures standing at the water's edge, watching us go. The next few days passed in a blur. Robert took me to the local clinic, where I was treated for mild hypothermia and shock. The doctor, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, listened to my story with a mixture of concern and skepticism. "You've been through quite an ordeal," she said gently. "Sometimes in high-stress situations our minds can play tricks on us. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced was real. The bruises on my arms and legs, in the distinct shape of handprints, were proof enough for me." Robert visited me at the clinic, his face etched with worry. "I should have warned you more clearly," he said, shaking his head. "I've seen too many people fall victim to the lake's influence." "What are they?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "Ghosts? Spirits?" Robert sighed. "I don't know. Maybe they're the souls of those who've died here over the centuries. Maybe there's something older, something that was here long before humans came to this place. All I know is that they're dangerous, and they're getting stronger." As soon as I was released from the clinic, I packed up my RV and prepared to leave Mono Lake. As much as the writer in me wanted to stay, to uncover the full truth of what was happening here, my sense of self-preservation finally won out. As I was doing one final check of the campsite, I found something that made my blood run cold. A small, old-fashioned shoe, caked with dried mud, had somehow appeared in the back of my RV. It was exactly the right size for a child Lily's age. I stood there holding the shoe, torn between the urge to fling it as far away as possible, and a morbid desire to keep it as proof of what I had experienced. In the end, I wrapped it in a plastic bag and tucked it into my suitcase. As I drove away from Mono Lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. In my rearview mirror, I could see the lake shimmering in the distance, and for a moment I thought I saw a small figure standing at the water's edge, watching me go. It's been nearly 40 years since that summer at Mono Lake, and I've never returned. The book I set out to write was never finished. How could I possibly put into words what I had experienced? Instead, I channeled my energy into researching similar phenomena around the world, uncovering a pattern of mysterious lakes and bodies of water associated with disappearances and strange encounters. But Mono Lake has never left me. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear the faint echo of singing, calling me back. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I catch a glimpse of something in my eyes, a depth, a knowing, that wasn't there before. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened to me at Mono Lake, or what Lily and the others truly were. But I do know this. There are places in this world where the veil between life and death, between our reality and others, grows thin. And in those places we must tread carefully, lest we find ourselves pulled into depths from which there is no return. As for the shoe I took from Mono Lake, it sits on my desk as I write this, a constant reminder of the mysteries that lurk just beneath the surface of our world. And sometimes, late at night, I could swear I hear it whispering, calling me back to the shores of that otherworldly lake. But I'll never go back. Some doors once opened can never truly be closed again. And some songs once heard will haunt you for the rest of your days.